Craft beer revolution, the pioneers and the first wave. Well, we've seen the pioneers in the United States, so now it's time to look at the first wave. In 1979 and 1980, inspired by Jack McAuliffe's example of New Albion, several homebrewers decided to open their own microbreweries. Let's see how they did. DeBacker Brewing Company. Fireman Tom DeBacker had been a homebrewer for 10 years. He visited both New Albion and Anchor, and his conversations with Fritz Maytag and Jack McAuliffe inspired him to open his own brewery. So in 1979, Tom and his wife Jan opened DeBacker Brewing in Novato, California. Like McAuliffe, they were not able to find new equipment that they could afford, and certainly in the United States there was nobody making equipment small enough for a microbrewery. The only companies that made brewing equipment were making them for huge breweries. So they were forced, like McAuliffe, to go to scrapyards and MacGyver equipment together from whatever scraps they could find. Like McAuliffe also, they could not afford advertising. Everything that they sold had to be through word of mouth. In their first year, they employed 4 people and they brewed 80 barrels of beer. Those were British ales, unpasteurized, unfiltered British ales. They decided to do that to try and stand out from the sea of tasteless lager that was all around them, provide some sort of contrast. The beer took 8 weeks from the time they started to the time they were able to sell it. That's a very long time for a small brewery, and would probably cause some cash flow problems. After all, you have to buy your ingredients, and if you're not able to sell the beer until 8 weeks later, that means you have to go 8 weeks without any kind of income. In 1980, they brewed 100 barrels of beer, and they sold everything that they had made. In 1982, the brewery finally turned a profit. The DeBackers knew that they had to expand in order to keep the momentum going, but when they went to the banks to ask for a loan, the banks were totally unwilling to provide them with that money. And they couldn't find anybody to invest in their brewery. So they ran the numbers. They were already running at full capacity. They were selling everything that they made. That meant that whatever profits they were making were the profits they were always going to make. Since they couldn't see a future increase in profits for a brewery of their size, they made the very hard decision in 1983 to close DeBacker Brewing. Boulder Beer Company. On September 29th of 1979, the state of Colorado issued a brewing license for the Boulder Brewing Company to David Hummer, Randolph Ware, and Alvin Nelson. Ware and Hummer were university physics professors and homebrewers, and together with Nelson, they built Colorado's first microbrewery. Now, it actually wasn't located in Boulder. It was located on a small farm northeast of Boulder, and the brew house originally was located in a former goat shed. They also, like the DeBackers, decided they needed to create some contrast with what was on the market already, so they also made British-style, full-flavored ales. Their Planet Porter actually won a blue ribbon at AHA's first homebrewing competition that was set up by Charles Papazian. They decided after this they needed to spend $25,000 to build a 3-story, 1,000 square foot building to replace that old goat shed. In 1980, they decided they needed to expand again, so they took the company public in order to raise funds. They raised $1.7 million, and they changed the name to Boulder Brewing Company Limited. By 1984, though, the brewery was exhibiting signs of trouble. All 3 of the original founders had left, and that's never a good sign. The people who were now running the company were showing a certain lack of vision. The beers, for instance, were fairly mainstream, nothing to write home about. And there was also a lack of leadership. Over the next 6 years, the company would have 5 presidents. 1985 was the year the brewery decided to move off of the farm and into town and expand. They were able to make more beer, but this was at a time when interest rates were between 14 and 20%. So the carrying costs on the loans that they needed to make that move meant that those high interest rates were cutting into their profits. As a matter of fact, in 1986, the brewery reported their first loss, $15,000 on revenues of $403,000. That was a sign of things to come. By 1990, the company was now $2 million in debt. Boulder Brewing Company had to declare bankruptcy. Now, a group of private investors, headed by a woman named Gina Day, decided to save the company. They changed the name to the Boulder Beer Company and took it private. They made the decision that in order to have a fresh revenue stream, they would add a restaurant to the brewery location. They also hired a new brewmaster and told him to get their beer mojo back. It seemed to work because in 1991, the company made $870,000 in sales. In 1992, Planet Porter, the original Planet Porter, was the only original recipe from the first days of the brewery. It won a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival. In 1993, the company came up with the clever idea of changing their name to the Rockies Brewing Company just months before the Colorado Rockies baseball team began to play in nearby Denver. By 1996, the Rockies Brewing Company was one of the fastest growing companies in the U.S., with $6.3 million in sales. In 2005, they decided to change their name back to the original Boulder Beer Company to celebrate their 25th anniversary. William S. Newman Brewing Company. William Newman was a British teacher and a journalist. He had learned how to brew beer in England, and when he emigrated to the United States, he obviously brought what he had learned with him. He was so disappointed in American lager that he decided to open a microbrewery in Albany, New York. It was the first microbrewery in the United States east of the Rocky Mountains. He also decided to make British ales, unpasteurized, unfiltered, and naturally carbonated. He made great beer. When it was good, it was world-class beer. The problem was he had such a small operation that he had consistency problems. The other problem is that Newman had assumed that the American beer market was identical to Great Britain. In Great Britain at the time, 80% of beer was sold on draft in pubs. In the United States, Newman didn't realize it was completely the opposite, that everybody bought their beer in bottles or cans. He didn't realize this, so he didn't install a bottling line. So, Newman beer was kegged for licensees, and if you really wanted some for your home, then you could go down to the brewery and get a refillable cubetainer filled. That was a small plastic-lined cardboard box that was the forerunner of a growler. By 1985, Newman realized that he couldn't survive on draft alone, but he didn't have the room or the money to install any kind of bottling line. He couldn't afford it, so he decided that he would contract out the brewing and bottling to larger breweries who could bottle. So he would use FX Mats of Utica, New York, Catamount of Vermont, and Schmitz of Philadelphia to brew up batches of his beer and then bottle them for him. In 1986, he ran into another kind of problem. He decided to call a dark, strong beer he made for the winter a winter warmer. Now, that is a traditional name in Great Britain. However, the Food and Drug Administration objected, saying that the name implied that the beer had medicinal properties. Newman was forced to change the name to plain old Winter Ale. In 1987, a disaster. While a large batch was being brewed at Schmitz, the brewery was bought by Heidelman. Overnight, Heidelman refused to honor the contract with Newman. They just dumped the batch of beer. All of Newman's capital was invested in that batch, and he was forced into bankruptcy. He had to sue Heidelman via the bankruptcy court. He finally settled with Heidelman, but Newman never reopened another brewery. So, the Newman Brewery turned out to be too small to be profitable. The quality was uneven. When it was good, it was great. Unfortunately, sometimes it was not good. And of course, he was really hurt by the lack of a bottling line. However, the interesting thing is he was the first one to show that this idea of contract brewing could be the answer to some of the issues that faced microbrewers. Interestingly, as a young man, Jim Cook of the Boston Beer Company did a short stint at Newman's Brewing. He later said, "I came away thinking, okay, the idea is right. I knew that it was possible to make world-class beer right here in the United States." Cook would go on with the Boston Beer Company to show exactly what you could do with contract brewing. Cartwright Brewing. In 1980, Chuck and Shirley Coury, who were winemakers in Portland, Oregon, opened Cartwright Brewing Company. It was Portland's first microbrewery. They made one single product, Portland beer. Frank Coury described it as having gusto. Most others actually described it as not great. Bottling was their Achilles heel. At first they tried bottling the beer while keeping the beer under pressure, but that caused so many technical and financial difficulties that they quickly switched to the idea of bottle conditioning. In other words, adding a small amount of wort or sugar to the beer, and then some yeast, and then capping the bottle. The yeast would eat the sugar, produce more carbon dioxide, and carbonate the beer naturally. The beer, as was stated before, was not great, and often it was very bad. And bottling continued to be a weak point of the operation. Nancy Ponzi, who went on to become a co-founder of the Oregon Brewers Festival, said later on, "The public forgave the beer's taste because they so much wanted a microbrewery in Oregon to work." However, despite strong public acceptance, the Courys only sold enough beer to brew once per week. Brewing, bottling, and aging also took a month for each batch. That's a long time for a small brewer to go between paying for the ingredients and selling the beer. In the end, they were only able to produce about 600 cases per month, and the beer sold for $1 a bottle. At the time in 1980, that was an extremely high price for beer. In the end, they simply were not able to produce enough beer and enough good beer. In 1981, the Cartwright Brewery closed. They had produced a poor quality product, they had a lack of technical expertise, and the product was relatively expensive. According to Fred Eckhart, the last remaining cases of Cartwright beer were auctioned off for $1 a case. Sierra Nevada. Ken Grossman had displayed an unusually advanced mechanical aptitude as a child. Two of his projects were building an underground bunker and a tree fort, both wired completely for electricity. He started homebrewing in school, at a time when homebrewing was still illegal in the U.S. He went on to study chemistry at college, and he took a bike tour of Southern California. It was during this bike tour that he fell in love with the small town of Chico. In 1976, he moved to Chico. He found work in a bike store, and there was a vacant room upstairs on the second floor, so he opened a homebrew shop. In 1978, he visited Anchor Brewing, and after talking with Fritz Maytag, he decided that he had to open a brewery. That became his life's ambition. He was also a member of the Maltose Falcons. You'll remember they were the first home brewing club in the United States, and they were the ones that had actually convinced the state of California to make home brewing legal. It was while he was a member of the Maltose Falcons that he met fellow homebrewer Paul Camusi. Together, they toured the New Albion operation and talked with Jack McAuliffe. In analyzing his operation, they decided that McAuliffe's 1.5 barrel output was too small to finance future growth. Now remember, this is in 1978, 4 years before McAuliffe was forced to shut down because he was unable to finance future growth through his profits. Through their analysis, they decided that if they had to open a brewery, they would have to have a much larger brew house. So, they sat down in 1979 and sketched out the main principles of the brewery. They would be that it would be a professional brewery. They were not going to scrounge around in scrapyards for equipment. They were not going to try and MacGyver stuff together. It was not going to be a glorified homebrewing operation. Instead, they would use professional equipment. They noticed that there were consistency problems at Anchor, there were consistency problems at New Albion, there were consistency problems at DeBacker, at the Coury's operation up at Portland, and they realized there was not enough of an emphasis on sanitation. They decided the problem was sanitation, and their brewery there was going to have an emphasis on cleanliness and sanitation to try and iron out those consistency problems. They'd already decided on the fact that they needed a larger brew house, and now they decided they needed a minimum of a 10-barrel brew house. Neither Fritz Maytag nor Jack McAuliffe had enough budget to do any kind of marketing. They decided that they needed to use marketing to attract and keep customers. And they needed a flagship beer. They needed a beer that would be identified all the time with their brewery. So, in 1979, they wrote up a business plan and they estimated their startup costs would be $50,000. Well, by selling everything that they had, Camusi and Grossman were able to raise enough money, and then they discovered that they would need actually another $50,000. That's when they had to go to family members and convince them to become investors. Grossman decided to call the new operation Sierra Nevada, after the nearby mountain range. In order to keep costs low, Grossman traveled to Yakima and convinced the growers there to sell him sample cuttings of hops that were usually used by large breweries for test batches. Finally, in 1980, they were ready to open, and they discovered once they opened that they worked 15-hour days every day of the week. Their first beer, they decided, would be a pale ale made with the American Cascade hops. Now, they were extremely picky about this beer because this was going to be their flagship beer. 10 batches were dumped down the drain before they were satisfied with it. The result was Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. The pale ale that would define a new American style of pale ale for a generation of brewers. They had thought their 10-barrel brew house would do them for, years and years and years. By 1983, after being only open for 3 years, demand had completely outstripped their ability to supply it. The 10-barrel system that they thought would provide enough capacity for years turned out to be way too small. Now, Grossman heard of a 100-barrel copper-clad system in Germany. He flew to Germany, took a look at it, bought it. With a friend, he dismantled it piece by piece and had it shipped to Chico, California. The problem was he couldn't afford to install it for another 3 years. In an interview years later with Sam Calagione, Ken Grossman said, "We weren't very knowledgeable about the commercial beer world. I mean, we were homebrewers. We tried to do our homework, and I got a hold of publications like Brewer's Digest and all the stuff down at UC Davis. But as far as having market intelligence and a pulse on who our customer was going to be and what the potential was for craft beer to survive, we were pretty naive." In fact, it was far more work than Ken Grossman ever realized. In his book Beyond the Pale, he wrote, "In truth, I haven't slept that well for the past 30 years. Burt Grant. Burt Grant's parents had moved to Toronto when he was a child, and he actually became a beer taster at a Toronto brewery during World War II. He spent 15 years as a brewing chemist at E.P. Taylor's Canadian Breweries Limited, and then moved to Stroh's, where he was a research director. He moved to Yakima in Washington State in 1973. In 1981, he incorporated the Yakima Brewing and Malting Corporation, and his first operation was called Grant's Pub. He built a brew pub in an old opera house in Yakima. It was the first brew pub in the United States. He was responsible for reviving several forgotten styles of British ales. For instance, Courage had stopped making Russian Imperial Stout a decade before. Burt revived that style. It was picked up by other craft brewers and now is made by hundreds, if not thousands, of breweries around the world. Mendocino Brewing. In the early 1970s, two men, Michael Laybourne and Norman Franks, met in Mendocino, California. They started teaching fermentation. They were both homebrewers, so during science classes at an alternate school, they would demonstrate fermentation by making beer in the class. In the mid-1970s, they started a construction company. But of course, they were also homebrewers, and they started to think, is there some way we can combine our two interests? We're good at making things, and we're also good at homebrewing. Was there a way to combine both skills? So they visited New Albion and talked to Jack McAuliffe. Now, Jack warned them about the money trap that he found brewing was. Now, up until that point in time, if you went into a brewery and bought beer, you had to buy it by the bottle or case, and then you had to take it home to drink. But California had just passed a new law that it was now legal to retail beer by the glass or bottle on site at the brewery. So somebody could come down, have a seat at a table, and be served a glass of beer and pay for it, and now it was all perfectly legal. Laybourne and Franks started to envision a brewery that might have, say, an attached tavern and a beer garden, a very German kind of idea. In 1982, they chose Hopland, California, a small town in Mendocino County, for their brewery. Now, it was a small town, but it had a highway running through it that connected California to Oregon, and 10 or 15,000 cars a day would travel along that highway. They leased an old building, and they started to build a brewery at the back. Now, in November of 1982, when New Albion finally closed down, they went to Sonoma County and bought Jack McAuliffe's equipment. They also hired Jack and his assistant brewer Don Barkley to come and help them get things off the ground. However, as we've seen, Jack stayed for a few weeks and then left the craft brewing industry for good. So in 1983, they opened, and they were California's first brew pub, and they were the second in the U.S. after Burt Grant's pub up in Yakima. They opened on August the 14th. Their first beer was an amber beer, and they named it Red Tail Ale. Now, the red tail hawk is plentiful in the region, and its tail was the color of the beer. But they also named it for a local song that was popular, the Red Tail Hawk. They decided from that point on that all their other beers would subsequently be named for local birds. Their first year of production was 300 barrels. In 1993, expansion was necessary because they were going at full tilt and selling everything that they brewed. So they decided to expand. But they needed money to expand, so they took the company public. They built a new brewery, and they changed the name to the Mendocino Brewery. However, in 1997, Vijay Mallya of the United Breweries Group of India bought a majority share. He was now in control of the company. First thing that he indicated was Mendocino was going to purchase Old Saratoga Brewery, an older regional brewery in New York. Now Mendocino had two bases from which to brew its beer, one in the west and one in the east. And he also had them start brewing Kingfisher beer under license from India. The current production of Mendocino is 75,000 barrels.